My name is Callie Turner. I am 22 years old, and my sister trapped me in a closet on the morning of my first real job interview. It was not an accident, not a stupid prank that went too far. She waited until I was dressed, my portfolio zipped, my route checked twice. Then she blocked the hallway, picked a fight I did not have time for, and shoved me backward into the narrow coat closet by the front door. I heard the latch click from the outside while she laughed that I was overreacting again. What hurt more than the lock was the silence that followed. My mother heard the commotion, saw the closet door shaking, and turned away. My father asked what was going on, listened just long enough to decide his eldest daughter was the future and that I was being dramatic. They told me I brought this on myself, that I never measured up, that missing one interview would not change anything for someone like me. Inside that closet, pressed between winter coats that did not belong to me, I watched the minutes dissolve in the thin strip of light under the door. My phone was on the kitchen counter. My bag was out of reach. Every second reminded me that the only people who were supposed to protect me were choosing to watch me fail. By the time I finally got out, the interview was gone, and so was the last bit of trust I had in that house. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The hours after I left that house did not feel real. I remember the cold air hitting my face on the front step and the weight of my suit jacket over my arm, but everything else was just noise. I walked until my legs hurt, passing the same row of duplexes near the factory, pretending I was just another stranger who happened to live in Toledo, not the girl whose own family had locked her away. Eventually, I stopped on a corner and called the only person I trusted enough to answer. Kayla did not ask for all the details. She heard my voice, heard the way it shook, and told me to come over. Her one-bedroom apartment above the laundromat smelled like detergent and old pizza, but her couch was free and she put a blanket in my hands without a speech about being grateful. That first night, I lay there fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, replaying each minute that had stolen my interview. In the morning, Kayla went to her shift at the diner and left a note on the coffee table telling me to use her laptop. That note did something my parents never had the patience to do for me. It assumed I could fix this. I opened a fresh document and started listing every place my name still lived in that house. The envelope with my birth certificate, the file with my social security card, the drawer where I kept copies of my school transcripts. I needed those documents if I ever wanted another chance. I did not go back there alone. Instead, I took the bus to the County Workforce Center, a squat brick building wedged between a discount store and a payday loan office. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed over faded posters promising new careers. At the intake desk, a woman in her 40s with a clipped name badge that read M. Vega looked up at me. She asked why I was there. And I told her the short version, the one without closets and locks. I said I had missed an interview for a logistics coordinator position and I needed help starting over. She watched me for a moment like she was measuring whether I believed my own sentence. Then she printed a list of openings, circled two that matched my partial experience, and slid a stack of forms across the counter. The forms asked about address history and references, things that my family had always used as a leash. Writing Kayla's apartment as my mailing address felt like moving a piece of furniture into a different life. When I hesitated over the emergency contact line, Ms. Vega leaned in just enough to point at the blank space and told me I did not have to fill that part out today. After I finished, she booked me into a resume workshop and a mock interview the following week. Before I left, she handed me a printed checklist of documents to collect: birth certificate, social security card, school records, proof of address. Each line on that paper was a reminder that my future was still tied to a place where people had celebrated watching me lose. That afternoon, I took the long way back to Kayla's apartment and counted the bus stops between the workforce center and my old street. It was not a long ride. I could have gone there in less than half an hour, walked up the porch steps, and asked for what was mine. Instead, I sat on the cracked plastic seat and watched my stop go by, knowing that the next time I headed in that direction, I would be going there with a plan, and not just with hurt. Back at the apartment, Kayla came home smelling like fryer oil and coffee, dropped her bag on the floor, and listened while I laid out the checklist. We spread the paper on the kitchen counter between a chipped mug and a stack of takeout menus. Saying each document's name out loud made them feel less like trophies my parents were guarding and more like tools I had the right to reclaim. We picked a day when we were both off and circled it in pen on Kayla's wall calendar. She offered to stand beside me on the porch, not as a shield, but as a witness, in case anyone tried to twist the story into something it was not. For the first time since that morning, the thought of facing that front door did not make me feel small. Those papers had always been treated like something my parents owned. At Kayla's counter, with ink still drying on the calendar, I finally understood they were proof of my life, and my life was no longer theirs to manage. The day came sooner than I expected. Kayla drove us across town in her old sedan. I watched familiar streets slide past the window and kept my hands flat in my lap. By the time we turned onto my old block, my stomach felt braced for impact. We parked in front of the duplex. I walked up the steps with Kayla beside me. She did not reach for my hand or try to talk me through it. Her quiet made it clear this was mine to finish. My mother opened the door with the stiffness she saved for strangers. Her gaze moved from my face to Kayla's and then to the street. I told her I had come for my documents, the ones with my name. I did not explain further. Saying it out loud made the request feel less like a favor and more like a right. My father stepped into the hallway. My mother repeated my words with a small shrug that turned them into a complaint. He studied me for a moment, weighing what it would cost him to cooperate. Then he disappeared down the hall and returned with a bent manila envelope. My name sat on the front in his heavy handwriting. He held it just far enough away to remind me how many things in this house had been dangled like that. When he finally let go, the envelope dropped into my palm with more weight than paper should have. My sister leaned in the doorway of our old room, arms folded. She did not speak. The curve at the corner of her mouth said enough about how she remembered what she had done. I did not wait for a comment or an apology that would never come. I turned, thanked no one, and walked back onto the porch. Outside, the air felt sharp. I held the envelope on the way down the steps, not out of fear they would change their minds, but because it carried the last pieces of my life they still controlled. At the workforce center, Ms. Vega nodded when she saw the stack of papers. She spread them on her desk, checking each one against my file. With every initial she scrawled in the corner, my name detached a little more from that address. My birth certificate went into a new sleeve, my social security card into a different folder. My existence was no longer just a package stored in my father's bedroom. They enrolled me in a short workshop on resumes and interviews. In a small room at the back of the building, a staff member showed a slide full of verbs and explained how most applications were scanned in seconds. I learned how to turn standing at a register into handling transactions and counting boxes after closing into checking inventory. Ordinary shifts became bullet points that made sense to people who had never seen my name. For the next few weeks, I treated finding a job like it was already my job. Mornings belonged to applications at Kayla's kitchen table, the laptop open beside whatever coffee she brought home from the diner. Afternoons, I spent at the library computers sending out resumes. At night, I picked up extra shifts stocking shelves or wiping tables, anything that kept cash coming in while I waited. The first interview offer came from a regional shipping company looking for someone to track deliveries and answer calls when trucks ran late. It was not glamorous, but it sounded like a door I could push open. When I walked into the interview room, I did not pretend to be relaxed. I set my resume on the table and talked through the kinds of problems I already knew how to handle: wrong invoices, lost cartons, customers who needed answers even when the system was slow. I explained that I wanted to be the person who knew where things were supposed to be and when. The manager asked a few practical questions and ended the meeting with a neutral smile. A few days later, an email arrived offering me the job. The pay was basic and the schedule unpredictable, but it came with training, a badge, and a desk that would be mine. Kayla celebrated with a frozen dinner and a toast with soda in chipped glasses. We laughed until the sound felt natural in my mouth again. Weeks later, sitting at a metal desk in that warehouse, I watched rows of tracking numbers crawl across the screen. Each update meant a truck was moving or a package had arrived. I logged times, corrected errors, and noticed that shifts could pass without my mind drifting back to the hallway outside that closet. The envelope with my documents was stored in a drawer at home, no longer a prize someone could withhold. My future finally lived in a place my parents could not touch. Ears at that first desk blurred into something bigger than survival. The shipping company never felt glamorous, but it was organized in a way my old life had never been. Trucks came in, routes changed, deliveries slipped, and had to be traced again. There were policies for everything, written down in binders instead of invented in the moment to excuse someone's temper. If I followed the procedures, I could fix things. If I made a mistake, there was a way to correct it that did not involve being called a disappointment. I learned the language of freight and schedules faster than anyone expected. Drivers started asking for me when their routes went sideways because I stayed until the system matched the reality they were describing. Supervisors noticed that the nights I worked the phones, fewer complaints escalated. When a regional manager audited our team, he circled my name with a note that I handled pressure well. That report led to more responsibility. I took on reconciling invoices, tracking which vendors consistently delivered on time and which ones needed hand-holding. I saw patterns in late arrivals and missing pallets and started flagging them before they turned into crises. Somewhere between early shifts and overtime, I stopped feeling like I was patching a broken life and started feeling like I was building one. When a construction firm posted an opening for a junior logistics analyst, it was Ms. Vega who sent me the link. The company specialized in industrial projects around the region, building out factory additions and retrofitting plants. They needed someone who understood both the numbers on a spreadsheet and the reality of trucks stuck behind accidents on the freeway. I sent in my application with a resume that now had concrete lines about shipments, rerouted freight, and cost savings. The interview felt different from the one I lost. It took place in a quiet conference room with a view of the river. They asked about bottlenecks and supplier reliability, not whether I was the responsible one in my family. A week later, an offer came with a salary that made Kayla whistle and a benefits packet thicker than any envelope from my parents' house. The new job brought a new routine. I rented a small apartment on the other side of Toledo, closer to the river and far from the duplex. At the construction firm, my work shifted from answering crises to preventing them. I built spreadsheets that ranked suppliers by accuracy and response time. I sat in meetings where budgets were set and listened as my boss explained how a single unreliable vendor could ripple through an entire project. Over time, I moved from analyst to coordinator and then into a role that put my name on the approval line. I was not the one signing the final contracts, but I controlled which companies reached that stage. My job was to vet vendors, confirm references, and flag anything that smelled like risk. It was the first time in my life that saying no to someone was treated as good judgment instead of defiance. By then, 5 years had passed since the closet. I did not count the exact days. I measured the distance in pay stubs, rent receipts, and the way my shoulders no longer tensed when the phone rang. My parents' number had been blocked for so long that I sometimes forgot the sequence altogether. The duplex near the factory became another address in my memory, a place I had lived once but no longer belonged to. One Tuesday afternoon, I opened a new stack of vendor files that had landed on my desk after a round of bids for a plant expansion. I flipped through insurance certificates and tax forms until I reached a packet from a small regional supplier. Their proposal was neatly typed, and their cover letter full of promises about reliability. Attached to the packet was a one-page sheet listing key staff. My eyes moved down the list, skimming titles and years of experience until they caught on a name at the bottom. The contact for sales and client relations shared my last name. The first name was one I had grown up hearing called from the bottom of the stairs. The letters blurred for a second before snapping back into focus. It was not a common combination. The sheet showed her job title, a phone number, and an email address inside a company domain instead of our old internet plan. Under a section for professional references, my own name appeared in print with a job title I recognized and a phone number that was not mine. The file sat open on my desk, the paper cool under my fingertips. In a building full of blueprints and steel schedules, my past had just arrived in a vendor folder, wrapped in polite promises and a forged version of my voice. Did not move the folder right away. The thin stack of paper sat on my desk while the office hummed around me, a reminder that the past had found a new way to write itself into my day. My name stared back from the reference section, printed beside a job title I actually held and a phone number I had never seen. Someone had built a version of me that existed only to vouch for her. Training manuals at the firm had an entire chapter on vendor vetting. I had read it until the language felt automatic. Conflicts of interest, falsified information, and misrepresentation were listed not as personal dramas, but as grounds for removal. The policy gave me something my childhood never had, a clear set of steps for what to do when someone lied. I opened a blank email and attached a scanned copy of the vendor sheet. In the subject line, I used the case code for the project and the phrase that signaled a potential compliance issue. In the body, I explained that the listed reference shared the same last name as the sales contact, that the phone number did not belong to me, and that my name had been used without permission. I kept the sentences short and factual. There was no mention of closets or family history, only the mismatch between what the paper claimed and what was true. Once the email was sent to compliance and copied to my manager, the file no longer felt like a secret I had to hold alone. It became part of a review process that would move forward whether or not I flinched at seeing my last name. An internal note appeared on the vendor record the next day. The project code had been flagged for additional review, and a meeting with the supplier was scheduled. My role was straightforward. I would sit in, provide context on the documentation, and answer questions about how the reference list had been checked. When the day of the meeting came, I arrived early to set up the room. Spreadsheets were projected on the wall, showing timelines, penalty clauses, and a comparison of bids. I kept my focus on the screen and on the notes in front of me. I did not look at the vendor side of the table until everyone had taken a seat. Only then did I lift my eyes and see the face that matched the name on the sheet. The years had not erased the tilt of her chin or the familiar way she scanned a room for leverage. She wore a blazer that tried to project confidence and a badge with her company's logo clipped to the lapel. The sight of her in a professional setting felt like stepping into a version of the life my parents had imagined, one where she was the star and I was still in the background. The compliance officer began with a review of expectations. I listened to the cadence rather than the words, grounding myself in the routine. Documents were laid out, signatures compared, details read into the record. When it was time to address the reference list, the officer turned to me for confirmation. I stated my position at the firm, clarified that my name had been listed without my knowledge, and confirmed that the phone number on the sheet was not connected to me or to any company line. A pause settled over the room. On the vendor's side, justification started to form, the kind that usually came when a discrepancy showed up. This time, the specifics did not matter. The rules were clear. Vendor information had to be accurate. References had to be real. The firm could not risk awarding a contract to a company that presented altered facts at the starting line. By the end of the meeting, the decision was recorded in formal language. The supplier was removed from consideration for the project due to misrepresentation in their submission. The file was marked accordingly, and the opportunity moved to the next candidate in the ranking. No one raised their voice. Signatures were added, the folder closed, and the project moved on without them. When the room emptied, I stayed behind to gather the printed pages. The chair where my sister had sat still angled toward the door. I straightened it out of habit and slid the vendor packet into the archive box reserved for closed cases. Walking back to my desk, I felt no rush of triumph. What had happened in that room was not revenge dressed up as procedure. It was simply a boundary enforced by a system that finally existed outside my parents' living room. A lie with my name on it had been corrected. And for once, the correction did not require me to sacrifice anything I had earned. The next wave hit outside office hours. A missed call from an unfamiliar local number flashed on my work phone as I shut down my computer. I watched it fade without answering. Unknown numbers were usually vendors or drivers who left messages when something mattered. This one did not. No voicemail appeared, no email followed. That evening, my personal phone buzzed on the kitchen table while I unpacked groceries. The same number filled the screen, tied to the city I had worked hard to avoid. I let it run out again. When the vibration stopped, a notification appeared. Curiosity pushed past caution, and I pressed play. My mother's voice filled the room, thinner than I remembered yet unmistakable. She skipped any greeting and went straight to overdue notices, rising late fees, and a landlord who had started knocking. In between, she mentioned my sister's job like a fragile object that might shatter if anyone breathed wrong. My name surfaced only when she reached the part about who should fix it. I listened once. The details sounded familiar, but they no longer felt like explosions I had to throw myself over. Standing in my own kitchen, with rent already paid and food on the counter, the panic stayed inside the recording. The calls kept coming over the next several days, always from the same number. I let each one die out until a new voicemail appeared, this time from my father. His tone was clipped, almost official. According to him, my sister had lost her position at the supplier after what he called a paperwork issue. The collapsed contract sat in the background as an unlucky coincidence. The company was cutting staff, she was out of work, and the duplex was close to eviction. He said this was exactly when family stepped up. That phrase carried more weight than any bill he described. In our house, stepping up had never meant sharing burdens. It had meant everyone rearranged themselves around my sister while I learned to disappear. I still did not call back. Instead, I saved both messages to a folder where I kept anything I might someday need to show someone else. Filing them away gave me a way to see what was being asked without being pulled under by it. One overcast afternoon, I walked out of the office and saw their car pulled in near the curb across the street. It took a second for my mind to match the fading paint and crooked parking job with the realization that they were waiting. My parents stood beside the sedan, coats buttoned, eyes fixed on the entrance. They started toward me as soon as I stepped onto the sidewalk. My mother began talking before we were even close enough to stand still. The landlord had posted a notice. Medical bills had stacked up from appointments my father could no longer postpone. My sister was at home, angry and jobless, insisting that the situation was unfair. Threaded through each sentence was the assumption that I was now responsible for turning things around. Underneath all the detail, the request was simple. They wanted money to catch up on rent and bills. They wanted me to leverage my job to smooth over my sister's reputation. They wanted things to slide back into an arrangement where their needs came first and my stability existed only as a resource. I listened until the pattern became clear, then told them I would not be erasing the consequences they were facing. I kept my voice steady. I said my finances were my own to manage, and that my position at the firm was not available as a tool for repairing decisions I had not made. If my sister needed help finding work, there were workforce centers, training programs, and counseling services in the city designed for exactly that. Some were connected to networks I knew through Ms. Vega. I offered to send information about those options by email. I did not offer cash. I did not offer a room. I did not offer a call to anyone connected to my projects. The line I drew was direct. Their situation belonged to them. Their reactions unfolded along familiar lines. My mother's expression hardened into something brittle, part outrage, part fear. My father's jaw tightened, old authority straining to reassert itself. This time, their judgment slid past instead of sticking. I had already proven, to myself if not to them, that I could keep a life running without their approval. When the conversation finally ran out of new angles, silence settled in. My parents turned back toward their car, carrying their expectations with them. I walked toward the bus stop at the corner, feeling the distance between us stretch into a space that looked less like exile and more like a boundary I had chosen. After they walked away from the office parking lot, the space they left behind did not feel empty. In the weeks that followed, calls from their city kept flashing on my screen. I stopped answering and saved each voicemail in the same folder as the first two, stored like documents instead of emergencies. The details shifted, but the pattern stayed the same. Overdue notices, a landlord losing patience, my sister's anger, my supposed duty to step in. One lunch break, I carried those recordings to a legal aid clinic above a coffee shop downtown. The attorney on duty listened with the calm of someone who had heard this story all week, then reduced it to a short list of facts. I was not on their lease, I had not co-signed their loans, and I had the right to ask for the calls to stop. A formal letter, he explained, could state that clearly and require that any future contact have a legitimate purpose. The letter went out a few days later on plain stationery. It did not catalog old injuries or argue about who had been cruel. It simply confirmed that I was an adult responsible for my own obligations and that my parents needed to manage theirs without me. After that, my life narrowed in a good way. I went to work, checked progress on jobs, and approved or rejected vendors based on performance instead of sentiment. Evenings were quiet. Simple meals, messages from Kayla, occasional updates from Ms. Vega about people she had helped move from unemployed to hired. News from my old address arrived indirectly. A neighbor posted a picture of the duplex with a notice taped to the door and furniture stacked on the lawn. Then months of silence until a relative mentioned my parents had moved into a smaller rental on the edge of town. My sister's name surfaced later, attached to a low-paying retail job with shifting hours and no clear path upward. The feeling that followed was not the rush I had imagined when I pictured justice. It was quieter, like a scale finally resting where it should. For once, the consequences of their choices had landed on them instead of on the person easiest to blame. Around that time, the Workforce Center began inviting former clients back as volunteers. Ms. Vega asked if I would help with a resume workshop for people who had more gaps than references, so I took an evening off from overtime and stood at the front of a small classroom that smelled faintly of markers and cheap coffee. Looking out at the room, I saw versions of my younger self in the way people gripped their pens. I walked them through turning long shifts into measurable skills, explained how to describe reliability without apologizing for survival jobs, and reminded them that being underestimated was not a permanent sentence. After the session, one woman lingered by the table of handouts. She did not ask what my parents had done or how bad it had been. She simply requested a pen so she could start a list of the documents she needed before she lost her nerve, then bent over the paper and wrote her name in firm, careful letters. Watching her, I realized the life I had built was no longer just a wall between me and the people who hurt me. It was also a doorway someone else might step through, a path that proved you could walk away from a story you did not write and still have something worth telling. People like to say that family is everything, that blood is thicker than any promise. From where I stand now, I think family is anyone who refuses to profit from your pain. the friend who makes space on a couch, the caseworker who treats your file like a person, the coworker who trusts your judgment without needing to know your past. If you grew up being told that you were the problem, that wanting more made you selfish, I hope my story gives you permission to question who that version of you really serves. Staying may feel easier than leaving, but a house that celebrates your failures is not a home, and you are allowed to draw a line and keep it. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If any part of my story sounded familiar, you can share your thoughts in the comments or simply let it sit with you for a while. And if you are watching this from a place that feels like a dead end, consider this a small sign that an exit is still an exit, even when no one else wants you to take it.